He arrived just at the moment when the Federalists of Marseille had surrendered Toulon to the English, Cape Verde Islands, Napoleon at the siege of Toulon, rise of Duhok and Junot, Napoleon quarrels with the representatives of the people, quarrels with Aubry, anecdotes relative to Vendômière. Napoleon General of the Army of Italy, integrity of his military administration, his disinterestedness, nicknamed Petit Corporal, difference between the system of the Directory and that of the General of the Army of Italy. September 1st, 6th. On the 1st of September, we found from our latitude that we should see the Cape Verde Islands in the course of the day. The sky was, however, overcast, and at night we could see nothing. The Admiral, convinced that there was a mistake in the reckoning of our longitude, was preparing to bear westward to the right in order to fall in with the islands, when a brig, which was ahead of us, intimated by a signal that she had discovered them on the left. During the night, the wind blew violently from the southeast, and if our mistake had been the reverse of what it was, and the Admiral had really borne to the right, it is not improbable that we should have been thrown out of our course, a proof that, notwithstanding the improvements in science, mistakes are very apt to take place, and that the chances of navigation are very great. As the wind continued to blow strong and the sea was boisterous, the Admiral preferred continuing his course rather than waiting to take in water, of which he believed he had already a sufficient store. Everything now promised a prosperous passage. We were already very far advanced on our course. Every circumstance continued favourable. The weather was mild, and we might even have thought our voyage agreeable had it been undertaken in the pursuit of our own plans and in conformity with our own inclinations. But how could we forget our past misfortunes, or close our eyes on the future? Occupation alone could enable us to support the languor and tedium of our days. I had undertaken to teach my son English, and the Emperor, to whom I mentioned the progress he was making, expressed a wish to learn also. I endeavoured to form a very simple plan for his instruction in order to save him trouble. This did very well for 2 or 3 days, but the ennui occasioned by the study was at least equal to that which it was intended to counteract, and the English was laid aside. The Emperor occasionally reproached me with having discontinued my lessons. I replied that I had the medicine ready, if he had the courage to take it. In other respects, particularly before the English, his manners and habits were always the same. Never did a murmur or a wish escape his lips. He invariably appeared contented, patient, and good-humoured. The Admiral, who I suppose thought it necessary, on the strength of our reputation, to fortify himself well on our departure from England, gradually laid aside his reserve and every day took greater interest in his captive. He represented the danger incurred by coming on deck after dinner, owing to the damp of the evening. The Emperor would then sometimes take his arm and prolong the conversation, which never failed to gratify him exceedingly. I have been assured that the Admiral carefully noted down every particular that he could collect. If this be true, the remarks which the Emperor one day made during dinner on naval affairs, on the French resources in the south, those which he had already created and those which he contemplated, and on the ports and harbours of the Mediterranean, to all of which the Admiral listened with deep attention and as if fearful of interruption, will compose a chapter truly valuable to a seaman. I will now return to the details collected during our ordinary conversation. The following relate to the siege of Toulon. In September 1793, Napoleon Bonaparte, then in his 24th year, was yet unknown to the world, which was destined to resound with his name. He was a lieutenant-colonel of artillery and had been only a few weeks in Paris, having left Corsica, where political events had forced him to yield to the faction of Paoli. The English had taken possession of Toulon. An experienced artillery officer was wanting to direct the operations of the siege, and Napoleon was fixed on. There will history take him up, never more to leave him, there commences his immortality. I refer to the memoirs of the campaign of Italy, for the plan of attack which he adopted, and the manner in which that plan was carried into effect. It will there be seen that it was he, and he alone, who took the fortress. This was a great triumph, no doubt, but to appreciate it justly, it would be necessary to compare the plan of the attack with the account of the evacuation. The one is the literal prediction, and the other is the fulfillment, word for word. From this moment, the young commander of artillery enjoyed the highest reputation. The Emperor never looks back to this period without pleasure, and always mentions it as the happiest portion of his life. The taking of Toulon was his first successful achievement, and it naturally excites the fondest recollections. The history of the campaign of Italy will present a faithful picture of the three generals-in-chief who succeeded each other during the siege, the inconceivable ignorance of Cartot, the gloomy brutality of Dopet, and the honest courage of Dugommier. Of them I shall here say nothing. At the first breaking out of the revolution, there was nothing but disorder in the matériel and ignorance in the personnel of the French army, which was owing both to the confusion of the times and the rapidity and irregularity with which the promotions had been made. The following story will afford an idea of the state of affairs and of the manners of the time. On his arrival at headquarters, Napoleon waited on General Cartot, a haughty man, covered with gold lace from head to foot, who asked him what duty he had been sent upon. The young officer modestly presented the letter which directed him to superintend, under the general's command, the operations of the artillery. "This was quite unnecessary," said the general, twirling his whiskers. "We want no assistance to retake Toulon, but, however, you are welcome, and you may share the glory of burning the town to the Emperor Napoleon. Morrow, without having experienced any of the fatigue." And he made him stay to sup with him. A party of 30 sat down to table. The general alone was served like a prince, while everyone else was dying of hunger, a circumstance which, in those days of equality, strangely shocked the new guest. The next morning, at break of day, the general took him out in his cabriolet to admire, as he said, the preparations for attack. As soon as he had crossed the height and came within sight of the road and harbour, they got out of the carriage and threw themselves down among some vines. The commandant of artillery then perceived some pieces of ordnance and some digging, for which it was literally impossible for him in the slightest degree to account. "Du pass," said the general haughtily, turning to his aide-de-camp, his confidential man. "Are those our batteries?" "Yes, general. And our park, there, close at hand. And our red-hot balls, in yonder houses, where 2 companies have been employed all the morning in heating them. But how shall we be able to carry these red-hot balls?" This consideration seemed to puzzle them both completely, and they turned to the officer of artillery and begged to know whether, through his scientific knowledge, he could not explain how the thing was to be managed. Napoleon, who would have been very much tempted to take the whole for a hoax, had his interrogators evinced less simplicity, for they were more than a league and a half from the object of attack, summoned to his aid all the gravity Lie was master of, and endeavoured to persuade them, before they troubled themselves about red-hot balls, to try the range of the shot with cold ones. After a great deal of trouble, he at length prevailed on them to follow his advice, but not till he had very luckily made use of the technical term coup d'épreuve, which took their fancy, and brought them over to his opinion. They then made the experiment, but the shot did not reach to 1/3 of the distance required, and the general and Dupas began to abuse the Marseillais and the aristocrats, who had, they said, maliciously spoiled the powder. In the meantime, the representative of the people came upon horseback. This was Gasparin, an intelligent man who had served in the army. Napoleon, perceiving how things were going on, and boldly deciding on the course he should pursue, immediately assumed great confidence of manner, and urged the representative to entrust him with the whole direction of the affair. He exposed, without hesitation, the unparalleled ignorance of all who were about him, and from that moment took upon himself the entire direction of the siege. Cartot was a man of such limited intellect that it was impossible to make him understand that to facilitate the taking of Toulon, it would be necessary to make the attack at the outlet of the road. When the commandant of artillery sometimes pointed to this outlet on the map and told him there was Toulon, Cartot suspected he knew very little of geography, and when, in spite of his opposition, the authority of the representative decided on the adoption of this distant point of attack, the general was haunted by the idea of treasonable designs, and he would often remark with great uneasiness that Toulon did not lie in that direction. Cartot wanted one day to oblige the commandant to erect a battery with the rear of the guns so close against the front of a house as to leave no room for the recoil. On another occasion, on his return from the morning parade, he sent for the commandant to tell him that he had just discovered a position from whence a battery of from 6 to 12 pieces would infallibly carry Toulon in a few days. It was a little hillock which would command 3 or 4 forts and several points of the town. He was enraged at the refusal of the commandant of artillery, who observed to him that if a battery could command every point, It followed that every point would be able to bear upon it, that the 12 guns would have 150 to oppose them, and that simple subtraction would suffice to show him his disadvantage. The commandant of the engineer department was called on for his opinion, and as he concurred without hesitation in that of the commandant of artillery, Carteau said that it was impossible to do anything with those learned corps, as they all went hand in hand. At length, to put a stop to difficulties which were continually recurring, the representative decided that Carteau should communicate to the commandant of artillery his general plan of attack, and that the latter should execute the details according to the rules of his department. The following was Carteau's memorable plan. The general of artillery shall batter Toulon during 3 days, at the expiration of which time I will attack it with 3 columns and carry it. At Paris, however, the engineer committee found this hasty measure much more humorous than wise, and it was one of the causes which led to Carteau's recall. There was indeed no want of plans for the retaking of Toulon having been proposed as a subject for competition in the popular societies. Plans poured in from all quarters. Napoleon says he must have received at least 600 during the siege. It was to the representative Gasparin that Napoleon was indebted for the triumph of his plan, that which gained Toulon over the objections of the committee of the convention. He preserved a grateful recollection of this circumstance. It was Gasparin, he used to say, who had first opened his career. In all the disputes between Carteau and the commandant of artillery, which usually took place in the presence of the general's wife, the latter uniformly took the part of the officer of artillery, saying with great naivete to her husband, "Let the young man alone, he knows more about it than you do, for he never asks your advice. Besides, are not you the responsible person? The glory will be yours." This woman was not without some share of good sense. On her return to Paris, after the recall of her husband, the Jacobins of Marseille gave a splendid fête in honor of the disgraced family. In the course of the evening, the conversation happened to fall on the commandant of artillery, who was enthusiastically praised. "Do not reckon on him," said she. "That young man has too much understanding to remain long à Saint-Julat." On which the general exclaimed, with a voice of a stentor, "Femme me Carteau, would you make us all out fools then?" "No, I do not say that, my dear, but I must tell you he is not one of your sort." One day, at headquarters, a superb carriage arrived from the Paris road. It was followed by a second and a third. At length no less than 15 appeared. It may be imagined how great was the astonishment and curiosity occasioned by such a circumstance in those times of republican simplicity. The grand monarch himself could not have travelled with greater pomp. The whole cavalcade had been procured by a requisition in the capital. Several of the carriages had belonged to the court. About 60 soldiers, in fine condition, alighted from them, and inquired for the general-in-chief. They marched up to him with the important air of ambassadors. "Citizen General," said the orator of the party, "we come from Paris. The patriots are indignant at your inactivity and delay. The soil of the Republic has long since been violated. She trembles to think that the insult still remains unavenged. She asks, why is Toulon not yet retaken? Why is the English fleet not yet destroyed? In her indignation, she has appealed to her brave sons. We have obeyed her summons and burn with impatience to fulfill her expectation. We are volunteer gunners from Paris. Furnish us with arms. Tomorrow we will march upon the enemy." The general, disconcerted at this address, turned to the commandant of artillery, who promised, in a whisper, to rid him of the heroes next morning. They were well received, and at daybreak the commandant of artillery led them to the seashore and put some guns at their disposal. Astonished to find themselves exposed from head to foot, they asked whether there was no shelter or epaulettes. They were told that those things were out of fashion, that patriotism had abolished them. Meanwhile, an English frigate fired a broadside and put all the braggadocios to flight. There was nothing but tumult in the camp. Some openly fled, and the rest quietly slipped after them. Disorder and anarchy now prevailed. Dupas, the factotum of the general-in-chief, a man of no ability, made himself busy, and was continually meddling with the artillerymen in the arrangement of their field train and batteries. A plan was formed to get rid of him. They turned him into ridicule, and urged each other on till they became very vehement in their jokes. On a sudden, Dupas appeared among them with all his usual confidence, giving orders and making inquiries about everything he saw. He got uncivil answers, and high words arose. The tumult spread on every side. Cries of l'aristocrate and la lanterne were echoed from every mouth, and Dupas clapped both spurs to his horse and never returned to annoy them. The commandant of artillery was to be seen everywhere. His activity and knowledge gave him a decided influence over the rest of the army. Whenever the enemy attempted to make a sortie, or compelled the besiegers to have recourse to rapid and unexpected movements, the heads of the columns and detachments were always sure to exclaim, "Run to the commandant of artillery and ask him what we are to do. He understands the localities better than anyone." This advice was uniformly adopted without a murmur. He adopted no precautions for ensuring his own safety. He had several horses killed under him and received from an Englishman a bayonet wound in his left thigh, which for a short time threatened him with the necessity of amputation. Being one day in a battery where one of the gunners was killed, he seized the rammer and with his own hands loaded 10 or 12 times. A few days after, he was attacked with a violent cutaneous disease. No one could conceive where he had caught it, until Myron, his adjutant, discovered that the dead gunner had been infected with it. In the ardour of youth and the activity of service, the commandant of artillery was satisfied with slight remedies, and the disorder disappeared. But the poison had only entered the deeper into his system. It long affected his health and well nigh cost him his life. From this disorder proceeded the thinness, the feebleness of body, and sickly complexion which characterized the general-in-chief of the army of Italy and of the army of Egypt. It was not till a much later period that Corvisart succeeded, by the application of numerous blisters on his chest, in restoring him to perfect health, and it was then that he acquired the corpulency for which he has since been remarked. From being the commandant of artillery in the army of Toulon, Napoleon might have become general-in-chief before the close of the siege. The very day of the attack on Le Petit Gibraltar, General Dugommier, who had delayed it for some days, wished to delay it still longer. About 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the representatives sent for Napoleon. They were dissatisfied with Dugommier, particularly on account of his delay. They wished to deprive him of the command, and to transfer it to the chief of the artillery, who declined accepting it. Napoleon went to the general, whom he esteemed and loved, informed him of what had occurred, and persuaded him to decide on the attack. About 8 or 9 in the evening, when all the preparations were completed, and just as the attack was about to commence, a change took place in the state of affairs, and the representatives countermanded the attack. Dugommier, however, still influenced by the commandant of artillery, persisted. Had he failed, he must have forfeited his head. Such was the train of affairs and the justice of the times. The notes which the committees of Paris found in the office of the artillery department respecting Napoleon first called their attention to his conduct at the siege of Toulon. They saw that in spite of his youth and the inferiority of his rank, as soon as he appeared there he was master. This was the natural effect of the ascendancy of knowledge, activity, and energy over the ignorance and confusion of the moment. He was, in fact, the conqueror of Toulon, and yet he is scarcely named in the official dispatches. He was in possession of the town before the army had scarcely dreamt of it. After taking Le Petit Gibraltar, which he always looked upon as the key of the whole enterprise, he said to old Dugommier, who was worn out with fatigue, "Go and rest yourself. We have taken Toulon. You may sleep there the day after tomorrow." When Dugommier found the thing actually accomplished, when he reflected that the young commandant of artillery had always foretold exactly what would happen, he became all enthusiasm and admiration. He was never tired of praising him. It is perfectly true, as some of the publications of the period relate, that Dugommier informed the committees of Paris that he had with him a young man who merited particular notice, for that whichever side he might adopt, he was certainly destined to throw great weight into the balance. When Dugommier joined the army of the Eastern Pyrenees, he wished to take with him the young commandant of artillery, but this he was unable to do. He, however, spoke of him incessantly, and at a subsequent period, when this army was, on the conclusion of peace with Spain, sent to reinforce the army of Italy, of which Napoleon soon after became general-in-chief, he found on his arrival that in consequence of all Dugommier had said of him, the officers had, to use his own expression, scarcely eyes enough to look at him. With regard to Napoleon, his success at Toulon did not much astonish him. He enjoyed it, he says, with a lively satisfaction, unmingled with surprise. He was equally happy the following year at Saoggio, where his operations were admirable. He accomplished in a few days what had been attempted in vain for 2 years. Vendémiaire, and even Montanotte, said the emperor, never induced me to look upon myself as a man of a superior class. It was not till after Lodi that I was struck with the possibility of my becoming a decided actor on the scene of political events. It was then that the first spark of my ambition was kindled. He, however, mentioned that subsequently to Vendémiaire, during his command of the Army of the Interior, he drew up the plan of a campaign, which was to terminate by a treaty of peace on the summit of the Simmering, which plan he shortly afterwards carried into execution at Leoben. It is perhaps still to be found in the official archives. The well-known fury of the times was still farther increased under the walls of Toulon by the assembling of 200 deputies from the neighbouring popular associations, who had proceeded thither for the purpose of instigating the most atrocious measures. To them must be attributed the excesses which were then committed, and of which the whole army complained. When Napoleon afterwards rose to distinction, attempts were made to throw the odium of these atrocities on him. It would be a degradation to seek to reply to such calumnies. As soon as Napoleon took the command of the artillery at Toulon, he availed himself of the necessity of circumstances to procure the reinstatement of many of his old companions, who had been removed from the service on account of their birth or political principles. He obtained the appointment of Colonel Gassendi to the post of keeper of the arsenal of Marseille. The obstinacy and severity of this man are well known. They frequently placed him in danger. It more than once required all Napoleon's vigilance and care to save him from the effects of the irritation which his conduct excited. The ascendancy which Napoleon had acquired through his services in the port and arsenal of Toulon afforded him the means of saving several unfortunate members of the emigrant family Chabrillon, or Chabrillon, who had been overtaken by storms at sea and driven on the French shore. They were about to be put to death, for the law was decisive against the emigrants who might return to France. They urged in their defence that their return had been purely the effect of accident, and was contrary to their own wishes. The only favour they solicited was to be permitted to depart. But all was vain. They would have perished had not the commandant of the artillery hazarded his own safety and procured for them a covered boat, which he sent off from the French coast under the pretence of business relative to his department. During the reign of Napoleon, these individuals took an opportunity of expressing their gratitude to him and informing him that they had carefully preserved the order which saved their lives. Napoleon was himself, at various times, exposed to the fury of revolutionary assassins. Whenever he established a new battery, the numerous patriotic deputations who were at the camp solicited the honour of having it named after them. Napoleon named one the Battery of the Patriots of the South. This was a sufficient ground for his being denounced and accused of federalism, and had he been a less useful person, he would have been put under arrest, or, in other words, he would have been sacrificed. In short, language is inadequate to describe the frenzy and horror of the times. The emperor, for example, has told us that while engaged in fortifying the coasts at Marseille, he was a witness to the horrible condemnation of the merchant Hugues, a man of 84 years of age, deaf and nearly blind. In spite of his age and infirmities, his atrocious executioners pronounced him guilty of conspiracy. His real crime was his being worth 18 millions. This he was himself aware of, and he offered to surrender his wealth to the tribunal, provided he might be allowed to retain 500,000 francs, which, he said, he could not live long to enjoy. But this proposition was rejected, and he was led to the scaffold. "At this sight," said Napoleon, "I thought the world was at an end," an expression which he was accustomed to employ on any extraordinary occasion. Barras and Fréron were the authors of these atrocities. The emperor did Robespierre the justice to say that he had seen long letter written by him to his brother Robespierre, the younger, who was then the representative to the Army of the South, in which he warmly opposed and disavowed these excesses, declaring that they would disgrace and ruin the revolution. Napoleon, when at Toulon, formed a friendship with many individuals who subsequently became very noted. He distinguished in the train a young officer whose talent he had at first much difficulty in forming, but from whom he afterwards derived the greatest services. This was Duhok, who, with a very unprepossessing person, was endowed with talent of the most solid and useful kind. He loved the emperor for himself, was devoted to his interests, and at the same time knew how to tell him the truth at proper seasons. He was afterwards created Duc de Fleury and Grand Marshal of the Palace. He placed the imperial household on an excellent footing and preserved the most perfect order. At his death, the emperor thought he had sustained an irreparable loss, and many other persons were of the same opinion. The emperor told me that Duroc was the only man who shared his intimacy and possessed his entire confidence. During the erection of one of the first batteries which Napoleon on his arrival at Toulon directed against the English, he asked whether there was a sergeant or corporal present who could write. A man advanced from the ranks and wrote to his dictation on the capoulement. The note was scarcely ended when a cannonball which had been fired in the direction of the battery fell near the spot, and the paper was immediately covered by the loose earth thrown up by the ball. "Well," said the writer, "I shall have no need of sand." This remark, together with the coolness with which it was made, fixed the attention of Napoleon and made the fortune of the sergeant. This man was Junot, afterwards Duke of Abrantes, Colonel-General of the Hussars Commandant in Portugal and Governor-General in Illyria, where he evinced signs of mental alienation which increased on his return to France, where he wounded himself in a horrible way. He died the victim of the intemperance which destroyed both his health and his reason. Napoleon, on being created General of the Artillery and Commandant of that department in the army of Italy, carried thither all the superiority and influence which he had acquired before Toulon. Still, however, he experienced reverses and even dangers. He was put under arrest for a short time at Nice by the representative Laporte because he refused to crouch to his authority. Another representative pronounced sentence of outlawry upon him because would not suffer him to employ his artillery horses for the service of the post. Finally, a decree, which was never executed, summoned him to the bar of the Convention for having proposed certain military measures relative to the fortifications at Marseille. When attached to the army of Nice or of Italy, he became a great favourite with the representative Robespierre the Younger, whom he described as possessing qualities very different from his brother. The latter Napoleon never saw. Robespierre the Younger, on being recalled to Paris by his brother, some time before the 9th of Thermidor, exerted every endeavour to prevail on Napoleon to accompany him. "If I had not firmly resisted," observed the emperor, "who knows whither this first step might have led me, and for what a different destiny I might have been reserved." At the army of Nice there was another representative, an insignificant man. His wife, who was an extremely pretty and fascinating woman, shared and even usurped his authority. She was a native of Versailles. Both husband and wife paid great attention to the General of Artillery. They became extremely fond of him and treated him in the handsomest manner. This was a great advantage to the young general, for, at that time, during the absence or inefficiency of the laws, a representative of the people was a man of immense power. The individual here alluded to was one of those who, in the Convention, most contributed to bring Napoleon into notice at the crisis of Vendémiaire. This was the natural consequence of the deep impressions produced by the character and capacity of the young general. The emperor relates that after he had ascended the throne, he again saw his old acquaintance, the fair representative of Nice. She was so much altered as to be scarcely recognizable. Her husband was dead, and she was reduced to extreme indigence. The emperor readily granted everything she solicited. He realized, he said, all her dreams, and even went beyond them. Although she lived at Versailles, many years had elapsed before she had succeeded in gaining access to him. Letters, petitions, solicitations of every description had proved unavailing. "So difficult it is," said the emperor, "to reach the sovereign, even when he does not wish to deny himself." At length, one day, when he was on a hunting excursion at Versailles, Napoleon happened to mention this lady to Berthier, who was also a native of that place, and had known her in her youth, and he, who had never yet deigned to mention her, and still less to regard her petitions, on the following day presented her to the sovereign. "But why did you not get introduced to me through our mutual acquaintances in the army of Nice?" inquired the emperor. "Many of them are now great men, and age on a constant footing of intimacy with me." "Alas, sire," replied she, "our acquaintance ceased when their fortune was advanced, and I was overtaken by misfortune." The emperor one day communicated to me some details respecting this old friendship. "I was," said he, "very young when I first knew this lady. I was proud of the favourable impression I had made on her, and seized every opportunity of shewing her all the attention in my power. I will mention one circumstance, to show for what trivial causes men sometimes abuse the authority on which the fate of their fellow creatures depends, for I am no worse than the rest. I was walking about one day with the representative's wife, inspecting our positions in the neighborhood of the Col de Tende, when I suddenly took it into my head to give her an idea of an engagement, and for this purpose ordered the attack of an advanced post. We were the conquerors, it is true, but the affair could be attended by no advantage. The attack was a mere whim, and yet it cost the lives of several men. I have never failed to reproach myself whenever I look back on this affair. The events of Thermidor having produced a change in the committees of the convention, Aubrey, formerly a captain of artillery, was appointed to direct the committee of war, and he remodelled the army. He did not forget himself. He obtained the rank of general of artillery, and he favoured several of his old comrades to the injury of the inferior officers whom he disbanded. Napoleon, who was at this time scarcely 25 years of age, became a general of infantry, and he was chosen for the service of La Vendée. This circumstance induced him to quit the army of Italy in order to protest against the change, which, on every account, was dissatisfactory to him. Finding Aubrey inflexible and even offended at his just representations, he gave in his resignation. The narrative of the campaigns of Italy shewed that only a short time elapsed before he was again employed in the topographic committee, by which the movements of the army and the plans of the campaigns were arranged. Here he was on the 13th of Vendémiaire. Napoleon's expostulations with Aubrey on the subject of his now appointment formed a perfect scene, he vehemently insisted, because he had facts to bear him through. Aubrey was obstinate and bitter, because he had power in his hands. He told Napoleon that he was too young, and that he must let older men go before him. Napoleon replied that a soldier soon grew old on the field of battle, and that he should speedily attain the suitable age. They came to very high words. I informed the Emperor that, on returning from my emigration, I occupied for a considerable time in the Rue Saint-Florentin, the identical apartment in which this scene took place. I had frequently heard it spoken of, and though it was described by unfriendly tongues, each, nevertheless, took great interest in relating the details, and in trying to guess the part of the room in which any particular gesture was made, or any remarkable word spoken. The history of the famous day of Vendémiaire, which had so important an influence on the fate of the Revolution and of Napoleon, will show that he hesitated for some time before he undertook the defence of the Convention. On the night succeeding that day, Napoleon presented himself to the Committee of 40, which was established at the Tuileries. He wanted to procure mortars and ammunition from Meudon, but such was the circumspection of the President Chambercaris that in spite of the dangers which had marked the day, he refused to sign the order, and merely, by way of accommodating the matter, requested that the guns and ammunition might be placed at the disposal of the general. During his command of Paris, subsequently to the 13th of Vendémiaire, Napoleon had to encounter a great scarcity, which occasioned several popular commotions. One day, when the usual distribution had not taken place, crowds of people collected round a baker's shops. Napoleon was parading about the city with a party of his staff to preserve public tranquillity. A crowd of persons, chiefly women, assembled round him, loudly calling for bread. The crowd augmented, the outcries increased, and the situation of Napoleon and officers became critical. A woman, of monstrous robust appearance, was particularly conspicuous by her gestures and exclamations. "Those fine epauletted fellows," said she, pointing to the officers, "laugh at our distress. So long as they can eat and grow fat, they care not if the poor people die of hunger." Napoleon turned to her and said, "Good woman, look at me, which is fattest, you or I?" Napoleon was at that time extremely thin. "I was a mere slip of parchment," said he. A general burst of laughter disarmed the fury of the populace, and the staff officers continued their round. The memoirs of the campaign of Italy show how Napoleon became acquainted with Madame de Benharnais, and how he contracted the marriage which had been so greatly misrepresented in the accounts of the time. As soon as he got introduced to Madame de Benharnais, he spent almost every evening at her house, which was frequented by the most agreeable company in Paris. When the majority of the party retired, there usually remained M. de Montesquieu, the father of the Grand Chamberlain, the Duc de Nivernais, so celebrated for the graces of his wit, and a few others. They used to look round to see that the doors were all shut, and they would then say, "Let us sit down and chat about the old court, let us make a tour to Versailles." The poverty of the treasury and the scarcity of specie were so great during the Republic that on the departure of General Bonaparte for the army of Italy, All his efforts, joined to those of the Directory, could only succeed in raising 2,000 louis, which he carried with him in his carriage. With this sum he set out to conquer Italy and to march upon the empire of the world. The following is a curious fact. An order of the day was published, signed Berthier, directing the General-in-Chief, on his arrival at the headquarters at Nice, to distribute to the different generals, to enable them to enter on the campaign, the sum of 4 louis in specie. For a considerable time no such thing as specie had been seen. This order of the day displays the circumstances of the times more truly and faithfully than whole volumes written on the subject. As soon as Napoleon joined the army, he proved himself to be a man born for command. From that moment he filled the theatre of the world. He occupied all Europe. He was a meteor blazing in the firmament. He concentrated all eyes, riveted all thoughts, and formed the subject of all conversations. From that time every gazette, every publication, every monument became the record of his deeds. His name was inscribed in every page and in every line, and echoed from every mouth. His appearance in the command produced a revolution in his manners, conduct, and language. Declès has often told me that he was at Toulon when he first heard of Napoleon's appointment to the command of the army of Italy. He had known him well in Paris, and thought himself on terms of perfect intimacy with him. Thus, said he, when we learned that the new general was about to pass through the city, I immediately proposed to introduce my comrades to him, and to turn my connection to the best account. I hastened to him full of eagerness and joy. The door of the apartment was thrown open, and I was on the point of rushing towards him with my wonted familiarity. But his attitude, his look, the tone of his voice, suddenly deterred me. There was nothing offensive either in his appearance or manner, but the impression he produced was sufficient to prevent me from ever again attempting to encroach upon the distance that separated us. Napoleon's generalship was, moreover, characterized by the skill, energy, and purity of his military administration, his constant dislike of peculation of any kind, and his total disregard of his own private interest. I returned from the campaign of Italy, said he, with but 300,000 francs in my possession. I might have easily carried off 10 or 12 millions. That sum might have been mine. I never made out any accounts, nor was I ever asked for any. I expected on my return to receive some great national reward. It was publicly reported that Chambord was to be given to me, and I should have been very glad to have had it, but the idea was set aside by the Directory. I had, however, transmitted to France at least 50,000 for the service of the state. This, I imagine, was the first instance in modern history of an army contributing to maintain the country to which it belonged, instead of being a burthen on it. When Napoleon was in treaty with the Duke de Modena, Salicetti, the government commissary with the army, who had hitherto been on indifferent terms with him, entered his cabinet. "The commander d'Este," said he, "the Duke's brother, is here with 4 millions in gold contained in 4 chests. He comes in the name of his brother to beg you to accept them, and I advise you to do so. I am a countryman of yours, and I know your family affairs. The Directory and the legislative body will never acknowledge your services. This money belongs to you. Take it without scruple and without publicity. A proportionate diminution will be made in the Duke's contribution, and he will be very glad to have gained a protector." "I thank you," coolly answered Napoleon. "I shall not for that sum place myself in the power of the Duke de Modena. I wish to continue free." A commissary-in-chief of the same army used often to relate that he had witnessed an offer of 7 millions in gold made in like manner to Napoleon by the government of Venice to save it from destruction, which offer was confused. The emperor smiled at the transports of admiration evinced by this financier, to whom the refusal of his general appeared superhuman, an action much more difficult and noble than the gaining of victories. The emperor dwelt with a considerable degree of complacency on these anecdotes of his disinterestedness. He, however, observed that he had been in the wrong, and that such a course of conduct was the most imprudent he could have pursued, whether his intention had been to make himself the head of a party and to acquire influence, or to remain in the station of a private individual, for, on his return, he found himself almost destitute, and he might have continued in a career of absolute poverty, whilst his inferior generals and commissaries were amassing large fortunes. "But," added he, "if my emissary had seen me accept the bribe, who can tell to what lengths he might have gone? My refusal was at least a check upon him." When I was placed at the head of affairs as consul, it was only by setting an example of disinterestedness and employing the utmost vigilance that I could succeed in changing the conduct of the administration and putting a stop to the dreadful spectacle of directorial peculations. It cost me an immense deal of trouble to overcome the inclinations of the first persons in the state, whose conduct at length became strict and irreproachable. I was obliged to keep them constantly in fear. How often did I not repeat in my councils that if my own brother were found to be in fault, I should not hesitate to dismiss him. No man in the world ever had more wealth at his disposal and appropriated less to himself. Napoleon, according to his own account, possessed as much as 400 millions of specie in the cellars of the Tuileries. His extraordinary domain amounted to more than 700 millions. He has said that he distributed upwards of 500 millions on endowments to the army. And, what is very extraordinary, he who circulated such heaps of wealth never possessed any private property of his own. He had collected in the museum treasures which it was impossible to estimate, and yet he never had a picture or a curiosity of his own. On his return from Italy, and on the eve of his departure for Egypt, he became possessed of Malmaison, and there he deposited nearly all his property. He purchased it in the name of his wife, who was older than himself, and consequently, in case of his surviving her, he must have forfeited all claim to it. The fact is, as he himself has said, that he never had a taste nor desire for riches. If I now possess anything, continued he, it is owing to measures which have been adopted since my departure, but even in that case it must depend on a hair's breadth chance whether there be anything in the world I can call my own or not. But everyone has his relative ideas. I have a taste for founding and not for possessing. My riches consisted in glory and celebrity. The Simplon and the Louvre were, in the eyes of the people and of foreigners, more my property than private domains could have been. I purchased diamonds for the crown. I repaired and adorned the imperial palaces, and I was often surprised to find that the expenses lavished by Josephine on her greenhouses and her gallery were a real injury to my Jardin des Plantes and my Musée de Paris. On taking the command of the army of Italy, Napoleon, notwithstanding his extreme youth, immediately impressed the troops with a spirit of subordination, confidence, and the most absolute devotedness. The army was subdued by his genius rather than seduced by his popularity. He was in general very severe and reserved. During the whole course of his life, he has uniformly disdained to court the favour of the multitude by unworthy means. Perhaps he has even carried these feelings to an extent which may have been injurious to him. A singular custom was established in the army of Italy, in consequence of the youth of the commander, or from some other cause. After each battle, the oldest soldiers used to hold a council and confer a new rank on their young general, who, when he made his appearance in the camp, was received by the veterans, and on the emperor's second abdication, somebody who loved him for his own sake, and who knew his imprudent disposition, eagerly inquired whether any measures had been taken for his future support. Finding that no provision had been made, and that Napoleon remained absolutely destitute, a contribution was raised for him, of which M. Lafitte became the depositary. At the moment of his departure from Malmaison, the solicitude of Napoleon's real friends was no less servile to him. An individual aware of the disorder and confusion of our situation wished to ascertain whether the little treasure had been forwarded to its destination. What was his astonishment on learning that the carriage in which it had been placed was left in a coach-house at Malmaison. A new difficulty arose. The key of the coach-house was not to be found, and the embarrassment occasioned by this unexpected circumstance delayed our departure for some moments. M. Lafitte wished immediately to give the emperor a receipt for the sum, but Napoleon would not accept it, saying, "I know you, M. Lafitte. I know you did not approve of my government, but I consider you an honest man." M. Lafitte seems to have been doomed to be the depositary of the funds of unfortunate monarchs. Louis VIII, on his departure for Ghent, also placed a considerable sum of money in his hands. On Napoleon's arrival, on 26 March, M. Lafitte was sent for by the emperor and questioned respecting the deposit, which he did not deny. On his expressing his apprehension lest a reproach should be intended to be conveyed in the questions which had been put to him, "None," said the emperor, "that money belonged personally to the king, and private affairs are totally distinct from political matters." Saluted with his new title, they made him a corporal at Lodi and a sergeant at Castiglione, and hence the surname of Petit Caporal, which was for a long time applied to Napoleon by the soldiers. How subtle is the chain which unites the most trivial circumstances to the most important events. Perhaps this very nickname contributed to his miraculous success on his return in 1815. While he was haranguing the 1st Battalion, which he found it necessary to address, a voice from the ranks exclaimed, "Vive notre petit caporal! We will never fight against him." The administration of the Directory and that of the General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy seemed two distinct governments. The Directory put the emigrants to death. The Army of Italy never inflicted capital punishment on any one of them. The Directory, on learning that Wurmser was besieged in Mantua, wrote to Napoleon to remind him that he was an emigrant, but Napoleon, on making him prisoner, eagerly sought to render an affecting homage of respect to his old age. The Directory adopted the most insulting forms in communicating with the Pope. The General of the Army of Italy addressed him by the words, "Most Holy Father," and wrote to him with respect. The Directory endeavoured to overthrow the authority of the Pope. Napoleon preserved it. The Directory banished and proscribed priests. Napoleon commanded his soldiers, wherever they might fall in with them, to remember that they were Frenchmen and their brothers. The Directory would have exterminated every vestige of aristocracy, Napoleon wrote to the democracy of Genoa, blaming their violence, and did not hesitate to declare that if the Genoese attached any value to the preservation of his esteem, they must learn to respect the statue of Doria and the institutions to which they were indebted for their glory. The Emperor determines to write his memoirs. 7th, 8th. We continued our course, and nothing occurred to interrupt the uniformity which surrounded us. Our days were all alike. The correctness of my journal alone informed me of the day of the week or of the month. Fortunately, my time was employed, and therefore the day usually slipped on with a certain degree of facility. The materials which I collected in the afternoon conversation afforded me no idle time till next day. Meanwhile, the Emperor observed that I was very much occupied, and he even suspected the subject on which I was engaged. He determined to ascertain the fact, and obtained sight of a few pages of my journal. He was not displeased with it. Having alluded several times to the subject, he observed that such a work would be interesting rather than useful. The military events, for example, thus detailed, in the ordinary course of conversation, would be meagre, incomplete, and devoid of end or object. They would be mere anecdotes, frequently of the most puerile kind, instead of grand operations and results. I early seized the favourable opportunity. I entirely concurred in his opinion, and ventured to suggest the idea of his dictating to me the campaigns of Italy. It would, I observed, be a benefit to the country, a true moment of national glory. Our time is unemployed, our hours are tedious, occupation will help to divert us, and some moments may not be devoid of pleasure. This idea became the subject of various conversations. At length the Emperor came to a determination, and on Saturday, the 9th of September, he called me into his cabin and dictated to me, for the first time, some details respecting the siege of Toulon. They will be found in the campaigns of Italy, which will form a separate work, without at all interfering with the anecdotes which I shall continue to note down here whenever an opportunity occurs. Trade wind. The Line. 10th the 13th. On approaching the line, we fell in with what are called the trade winds, that is to say, winds blowing constantly from the east. Science explains this phenomenon in a way sufficiently satisfactory. When a vessel sailing from Europe first encounters these winds, they blow from the northeast. In proportion as the ship approaches the line, the winds become more easterly. Calms are generally to be expected under the line. When the line is crossed, the winds gradually change to the south, until they blow in the direction of the southeast. At length, after passing the tropics, the trade winds are lost, and variable winds are met with, as in our European regions. A ship sailing from Europe to St. Helena is always driven a westerly direction by these constant easterly winds. It would be very difficult to gain that island by a direct course, and indeed this is never attempted. The ship stands away to the variable winds in the southern latitude, and then shapes her course towards the Cape of Good Hope, so as to fall in with the trade winds from the southeast, which bring her, with the wind astern, to St. Helena. Two different courses are taken to gain the variable winds of the southern latitudes. The one is to cross the line about the 20th or 24th degree of longitude, reckoning from the meridian of London. Those who prefer this course affirm that it is less exposed to the equatorial calms, and that though it frequently has the disadvantage of carrying the vessel within sight of Brazil, yet it enables her to make that part of her voyage in a short time. Admiral Cockburn, who was inclined to regard this course as a prejudice and a routine, determined in favour of the second method, which consisted in steering more to the east, and followed particular examples with which he was acquainted. He endeavoured to cross the line about the 2nd or 3rd degrees of longitude. He doubted not that, standing towards the variable winds, he should pass sufficiently near St. Helena to shorten his passage considerably, if even he did not succeed in reaching the island by tacking without leaving the trade winds. The winds, to our great astonishment, veered to the west, a circumstance which the Admiral informed us was more common than we supposed, and this tended to favour his opinion. He abandoned the bad sailors of his squadron in proportion as they lagged behind, and he determined on gaining the place of his destination with all possible speed. A storm, examination of certain libel upon the Emperor, general reflections. 14th, 18th. After a few slight gales and several calms, we had on the 16th a considerable fall of rain, to the great joy of the crew. The heat was very moderate. It may indeed be said that with the exception of the storm at Madeira, we had uniformly enjoyed mild weather. But water was very scarce on board the ship, and for the sake of economy, the crew took advantage of the opportunity of collecting the rainwater, of which each sailor laid by a little store for his own use. The rain fell heavily just as the Emperor had got upon deck to take his afternoon walk. But this did not disappoint him of his usual exercise. He merely called for his famous grey great-coat, which the English regarded with deep interest. The Grand Marshal and I attended the Emperor in his walk. The rain descended heavily for upwards of an hour. When the Emperor left the deck, I had great difficulty in stripping off my wet clothes. Almost everything I wore was soaked through. For several succeeding days, the weather continued very rainy. This somewhat impeded my labours, for the damp penetrated into our wretched little cabin, and on the other hand, it was not very agreeable to walk on deck. This was the first time during our passage that we had had anything like a continuance of wet weather, and it quite disconcerted me. I filled up the intervals between my hours of occupation in conversing with the officers of the ship. I was not on intimate terms with any of them, but one was in the habit of observing civility and politeness to them all. They loved to talk with us on French affairs, and their ignorance of all that concerned France and the French people was almost incredible. We excited mutual astonishment in each other. They surprised us by their degenerate political principles, and we astonished them by the novelty of our ideas and manners, of which they had previously formed no conception. They certainly knew infinitely less of France than of China. One of the principal officers of the ship, in a familiar conversation, happened to say, "I suppose you would be very much alarmed if we were to land you on the coast of France." "Why so?" I inquired. "Because," replied he, "the king would perhaps make you pay dearly for having left your country to follow another sovereign, and also because you wear a cockade which he has prohibited." "And is this language becoming an Englishman?" observed I. "You must be degenerated indeed. You are, it is true, far removed from the period of your revolution, to which you so justly apply the epithet glorious. But we, who are nearer to ours, by which we have gained so much, may tell you that every word you say is heresy. In the first place, our punishment depends not on the king's pleasure, we are subject only to the law. Now, there exists no law against us, and if any law were to be violated for the purpose of applying to our case, it would be your duty to protect us. Your general has pledged himself to do so by the capitulation of Paris, and it would be an eternal disgrace to the English ministry were they to permit the sacrifice of lives which their public faith had solemnly guaranteed. In the next place, we are not following another sovereign. That the Emperor Napoleon was our sovereign is an undeniable fact, but he has abdicated, and his reign is at an end. You are confounding private actions with party measures, love and devotedness with political opinions. Finally, with regard to our colours, which seem to have dazzled you much, they are but a remnant of our old costume. We wear them today only because we wore them yesterday. One cannot with indifference lay aside things to which one is attached that can only be done from constraint or necessity. Why did you not deprive us of our colours when you deprived us of our arms? The one act would have been as reasonable as the other. We are here only as private men. We do not preach sedition. We cannot deny that these colours are dear to us. We are attached to them because they have seen us victorious over all our enemies, because we have paraded them in triumph through every capital in Europe, and because we wore them while we were the first nation in the world." On another occasion, one of the officers, after glancing at the extraordinary vicissitude of recent events, said, "Who knows whether we may not yet be destined to repair the misfortunes which we have occasioned to you? What would be your astonishment if Wellington should one day conduct Napoleon back to Paris?" "I should be astonished indeed," I replied, "but I should certainly decline the honour of being one of the party. At such a price, I would not hesitate to abandon Napoleon himself. But I may rest easy on that score, for I can swear Napoleon will never put me to such a trial. It is from him I imbibe these sentiments. It was he who cured me of the contrary doctrine, which I call the error of my youth." The English were also very fond of asking us questions concerning the emperor, whose character and disposition, as they afterwards avowed, had been described to them in the falsest colours. It was not their fault, they observed, if they formed an erroneous estimate of his character. They knew him only through the works published in England, which were all greatly exaggerated, and much to his prejudice, they had several of those publications on board the ship. One day I happened to cast my eyes on one of a most malignant character. On another occasion, when I was about to look on a book which one of the officers was reading, he suddenly closed it, observing it was so violent against the emperor that he could not prevail on himself to let me see it. Another time, the admiral questioned me respecting certain imputations contained in different works in his library, some of which he said enjoyed a degree of credit, while all had produced a great sensation in England. This circumstance suggested to me the idea of successively examining all the works of this kind that were on board the ship, in order to note down my opinion of them in my journal, conceiving that so favourable an opportunity might never again occur of obtaining, if I chose, information on these points, which it might be worthwhile to inquire into. Before I commence my review of these works, I must beg to offer a few general remarks. They will suffice to answer in anticipation many of the numberless accusations that will fall in my way. Calumny and falsehood are the arms of the civil or political, the foreign or domestic enemy. They are the resource of the vanquished and the feeble, of those who are governed by hatred or fear. They are the food of the drawing-room and the garbage of the public place. They rage with the greater fury in proportion as their object is exalted. There is nothing which they will not venture to propagate. The more absurd, ridiculous, and incredible calumnies and falsehoods may be, the more eagerly are they received and repeated from mouth to mouth. Triumph and success are but fresh causes of irritation. A moral storm will invariably gather, and bursting in the moment of adversity, it will precipitate and complete the fall, and will become the immense lever of public opinion. No man was ever so much assailed and abused as Napoleon. No individual was ever the subject of so many pamphlets, libels, atrocious and absurd stories and false assertions. This may be because he rose from the common rank of life to supreme distinction, and advanced at the head of a revolution which he himself had civilized. These two circumstances plunged him into a deadly contest with the rest of Europe, a contest in which he was subdued only because he wished to terminate it too speedily. Napoleon, the conqueror of his neighbours, and in some measure a universal monarch hated by the aristocrats of Europe as a Marius, by the demagogues as a Sylla, and by the republicans as a Caesar, raised against himself a hurricane of passions both at home and abroad, while he had on his side only the genius, the force, and the destiny of his own power. Despair, policy, and fury in every country painted him as an object of detestation and alarm. Thus, all that has been said against him can excite no astonishment. It is only surprising that more calumny has not been uttered, and that it has not produced a much greater effect.